I didn't really figure out how to write a love poem for at least 8-10 years. So it's tough to figure out your own voice and your own voice within a very, very specific subject. And it's just called stubbornness and luck.
We're going to begin with something I'm super, super excited to say. I don't get to say this enough. This first talk is a fellow Canem poet. Maybe you didn't hear that. This next first talk is a fellow Canem poet. He is a professor of poetry over at OSU. His poems and his photographs. If you haven't seen his photographs, talk to him about film. I don't know much about film, but he does. So you can talk to him all about black and white photos and things like that. Appeared in publications like the American Poetry Review, the New Yorker, New York Times Magazine. His second poem of books, Pardon My Heart, from Northwestern University Press, was released in 2018. Marcus Jackson lives in Ohio with his wife and child, who are both wonderful people. Please give a nice, warm welcome to Marcus.
Hey everyone. Thank you all for being here. Big thanks to Jeff and to Verses. Big thanks to the museum. Every time I'm in this space, it seems like good things and healing happen. I want to give a shout out to my son, who it's his birthday weekend. That's why I got a boogie early. He's having a party that I got to run to. I love the subject for today. It's very practical, the word advice. And I think about how to stay in the writing life a lot. And it really just comes down to stubbornness and luck, which I originally wrote about for the Southern Review a few years back when my second book was coming out, and I still feel the same way. I'm going to read from that piece, but essentially, I began writing poetry when I was 14. And most people, when they start writing poetry, will write about love or loss. I was writing about love because my heart had been broken. I was an emo teenager. I promise it wasn't my fault why my heart got broken. And I just kind of dove into writing poems because my sister, who was really the alpha sibling of the two of us, we're only a year apart. And she's a badass. And when I got my heart broken, she's like, since you're too sensitive to confront the person that your former beloved is now dating, why don't you just write her a poem? She said it kind of jokingly, but I took it sincerely, so that's how I got into poetry. Of course, my poems were so bad, right? And I didn't really figure out how to write a love poem for at least 8-10 years. And then about 25 years later, I published what I consider as an entire book of love poems. So I'm going to read a piece of prose I wrote about those subjects. And it's just called Stubbornness and Luck. And I might read a poem. I might read a grown-up love poem. I wrote too many bad teenage love poems, so maybe I'll read a grown-up love poem. At age 14, I wrote my first poem, an awful sequence of rhyming couplets that I originally began in a half-baked attempt to convince a schoolmate to leave the guy she was sleeping with and resume dating my bleak, virginal self. Aside from yielding a horrible poem, and aside from drawing no response at all from the former girlfriend whom I cherished, the writing and revision process during the few days I labored over the ridiculous drafts changed me permanently. Even though the actual lines and sentences ended up being hogwash in each iteration, my commitment to sitting down with paper and pen for multiple sessions was a crucial contradiction to the types of behaviors in which society expected me to partake. The future plans most of my friends and I had plans we had inherited from our factory city's terse mantras or parameters were to keep developing our jump shots and our sprinting speed, to earn athletic scholarships to any college willing to sniff us, or to try and stay felony free until we could slide from high school into pension-crowned jobs at the Jeep and Chrysler plants, where many of our kin and community members toiled. I composed and revised that paltry first poem in the Burger King 2 blocks from where I lived. Those days, half of the dining area bore signage proclaiming smoking. I ordered fries, took my tray to a window table, lit one of my Newport 100s, and commenced to poem making. The importance of the experience resided mainly in the surrounding intricate details. The restaurant was not busy, and the people working a shift moved about their stations and assignments with an earned ease. It was winter. The evening's final angles of sunlight came through the glass and gave a forthright grace to my menthol smoke. The long dispenser of fountain sodas whirred, sometimes rumbling while generating or resettling interior stocks of ice. A couple of times, I noticed other patrons looking at me with a slight disorientation that broke quickly into glancing elsewhere and giving me back my relative privacy. These strangers affirmed the new space, peace, and purpose into which I had wandered. Right now, 24 years removed, more years now, 24 years removed from that first poem, I'm typing all this into a laptop while I sit again before a window at a coffee shop in the core of a sizable mid-American city. Spoiler alert, it's Columbus. This time around, there are 3 strangers nearest me. 2 of them are handsome, well-cologned men, no older than 35. Overhearing everything, I ascertain that they have met to hash out, with the aid of matching iPads I assume their workplace has provided, some intricate protocol of sales-driven communique they must soon unfold into emails and calls aimed at a sector of their clientele whom they designate as, quote, high risk, high reward. Conversely, the other person seated close is alone, in her 30s, and she's reading a thick, hardcover book of prose that looks to be borrowed from the university library about 10 blocks from here. In my periphery, one of her hands slowly sweeps across the new page just after she turns it, a gesture that can conjure a brief wind shifting an elm bough among the edge of a public park. The co-working men are now talking in raised tones, which carry competitiveness and perhaps a fearful bitterness. The woman reading has finished her iced coffee, and she has begun chewing each partially melted cube. The writing life is stubbornness and luck, enough of each to make ourselves available for receiving the essential vibrations the world and its people tirelessly generate. For me, the production rate of good drafts is less engulfing than presenting myself consistently as a patient witness to whatever and whoever are in proximity. Even if the folks at this cafe begin to bore or sour me, I'm going to glance out onto the sidewalk, pedestrians in the midst of a modest April day. Even if none of the passers-by gives me a bit of transferable emotion, my attention will find a puddle near the curb that quivers every time another vehicle hurries toward some place that must be worthy of perceiving. So it's really just sitting down and trying and failing and figuring it out. Thank you. I'll read just one love poem. I think my son appears in this. Yeah, if I can find it. Why is it hard to write love poems? I think it's difficult to get distance from the moment, but also sometimes love is so tied up in your history with trauma, other relationships that you've experienced. It's also tied into a lot of the cliches and conditioning that mass media and mass entertainment gives us. So it's tough to figure out your own voice and your own voice within a very, very specific subject. And it took me a couple decades, but I got a couple keepers. When you begin writing about love, I think you want to make a pretty simple scene or bring the reader into a situation that they can access. And then the more and more you write about it, you realize that there's so much, in my case, history with capitalistic and empire-based violence, treachery, ladder climbing, and also a lot of familial complication. And then if you add on all the books that you end up reading or half reading, and all the artists that you truly cherish that aren't poets or aren't literature, you might get a poem that's kind of a jambalaya, that has a little bit of most of the things you've experienced, or at least really quickly represented. And this was a poem that I wrote very late in the collection when I wanted to make some type of complicated love poem. And the main, if I remember correctly, the main task I gave myself was to get Shakespeare or a Shakespearean character and Donny Hathaway into a poem at the same time. So even if the rest of the poem is trash, I'll take it. It's called Dark-Eyed Air. We're watching living Europeans dramatize the lives of dead, aestheticized Europeans. Grabbing a Monday matinee near the center of an American city in which our significantly Negro son is learning the paradoxes of sharing before lying for a nap on an assigned cot at daycare. The movie spans many foggy heaths and bleak castle expanses that look like no black folks have ever or will ever pass through. So my wife and I, sipping whiskey from a flask, watch cautiously in the empty film house, somehow feeling all the cinematic and cultural whiteness might advance from the screen across the dark ceiling and walls and swallow us. Our wariness dissolves and boredom forms. So we walk out, the avenue's urgent motion and sound renewing us. And we head for a pub with a colorful jukebox that holds plenty of Donny Hathaway, a man whose mind, like Macbeth's, was full of scorpions, a man who, unlike Macbeth, made music sure to stir my wife and me, until we must gather ourselves, pay for our frank drinks, take a full bus, and retrieve our son, dark-eyed heir to all the streets and songs this kingless land sustains. Thank you.